June 2007, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. At 11:40 in the morning, in full daylight under a flat white sky, 4 British SAS operators walked through a Taliban-controlled valley and no one fired a shot. 2 days earlier, a US Marine platoon had tried to cross the same ground and had been engaged within minutes. Machine gun fire from multiple directions, RPGs from concealed positions. Contact so immediate that the patrol was forced to withdraw. The conclusion was simple: the valley was fully observed and daylight movement was not viable. The terrain explained it. From a distance it looked open, but at ground level it broke into short sight lines, mud compounds, irrigation ditches, and thin tree lines that gave just enough cover for a fighter to disappear. You could move through it and still be watched the entire time without knowing from where. The Marines had moved the way they were trained: fast, controlled, aggressive. They bounded between cover, scanned rooftops, communicated constantly, and maintained tight formations. It was disciplined, but it created patterns. Speed created noise, formations created predictability. Their intent was visible. The Taliban fighters did not need advanced optics. They understood behavior. Foreign soldiers moved with urgency, and urgency meant purpose. That purpose made them targets. The fighters waited, tracked the approach, and engaged at the moment of exposure. The Marines fought back and got out, but the result confirmed something important. The enemy did not need to dominate the terrain. They only needed to recognize how their opponent moved. When the SAS patrol requested to move through the same valley in daylight, the reaction was cautious. Suggestions for overwatch and support were made. The SAS patrol leader declined most of it. No additional elements, no unnecessary radio traffic. 4 men would go in alone. The decision was not about firepower, it was about perception. They stepped off just before midday. From a distant observation post, they looked exposed. There was no urgency, no tight formation, no obvious use of cover. They moved steadily, spacing themselves naturally, never bunching, never forming a clear pattern. Their pace was consistent but unremarkable, not slow enough to draw attention and not fast enough to signal intent. At one point, one operator stopped completely in the open for nearly a full minute. The others did not freeze or cluster. They kept moving just enough to maintain spacing without highlighting the pause. There was no visible communication, no exaggerated reaction. Then he moved again, and the patrol continued as if nothing had happened. From the Marine position, it did not look like stealth. It looked like nothing. That was the difference. Military training conditioned soldiers to show awareness of danger, to move with visible tension, to anticipate contact. The SAS patrol did not display that tension. They were alert, but not visibly so. What they were doing was not traditional concealment. They were managing perception. The Taliban fighters in the valley were not scanning constantly for hidden movement. They were watching for patterns that indicated threat. Fast movement, sudden changes in direction, groups compressing near cover. Those signals never appeared. The SAS were visible, but they did not look like a unit preparing to fight. By the time they reached the center of the valley, the silence had become noticeable. This was the same ground that had produced immediate contact less than 48 hours earlier. Same compounds, same tree lines. But now there was no reaction. At 12:22, the patrol adjusted direction slightly toward a low compound near an irrigation ditch. There was no shift in posture, no increase in speed. They passed it the same way they had moved through the rest of the valley. Inside that compound were 3 Taliban fighters who had engaged the Marines during the previous patrol. One of them noticed the movement outside, 4 men passing within range. He watched them, trying to interpret what he was seeing. They were not moving like soldiers preparing to clear a position. They were not scanning aggressively or reacting to threats. There was no urgency, no signal of action. It did not match expectation. In environments like that, expectation drives reaction. The hesitation lasted only seconds, but it was enough. The patrol passed without incident. The SAS did not stop, did not engage, and did not acknowledge the position. They already knew it was there. The purpose of the patrol was not to dominate the space, but to understand it without changing it. By the time they exited the valley, they carried precise information. Number of fighters, weapon types, movement patterns, likely resupply routes, timing of activity. It was the kind of intelligence that could not be gathered through force, because force changed behavior immediately. Back at the compound, the question came quickly: how they had crossed without taking fire. The SAS patrol leader answered simply: they had been seen. That answer caused confusion. If they had been seen, why had no one engaged? The response was direct: because they had not looked like something worth engaging. That idea challenged a basic assumption. Military effectiveness was usually tied to speed, aggression, and control. What the SAS demonstrated was different: the ability to move through a hostile environment without triggering the reactions that defined it as hostile. Not by becoming invisible, but by avoiding recognition as a threat. The difference was small in appearance, but decisive in effect. The Marines had entered as a clear danger and had been treated accordingly. The SAS had entered without presenting a clear reason to be engaged. The terrain had not changed. The enemy had not changed. Only the interpretation had changed. That detail would not stand out in reports. It would be written as successful reconnaissance. But the men who watched it understood something more precise. The patrol had not avoided detection. It had avoided classification. And once that difference was understood, it raised a harder question. If survival depended not on how well you could fight, but on whether the enemy chose to fight you at all, then the problem was no longer just tactical. It was behavioral. It required changing not only what you did, but how it appeared when you did it. That realization did not arrive all at once. It started quietly, with 4 men walking through a valley in daylight and no one pulling a trigger. But it stayed, and for those who had watched it happen, it became difficult to ignore that something important had shifted. The first joint patrol happened 3 days later, just after 10 o'clock in the morning. This time, the Marines didn't argue. They had seen the SAS move through a controlled valley in daylight without contact, and that was enough to override instinct at the small unit level. What they hadn't understood yet was that what they had seen was not a technique you could copy. It looked simple from a distance. That was the problem. The plan was straightforward. A mixed patrol, 2 SAS operators integrated with a Marine squad, would move through a neighboring sector with similar terrain and confirmed enemy presence. The objective was reconnaissance, not engagement. Identify movement routes, confirm positions, avoid contact if possible. The Marines adjusted immediately to what they believed was the lesson. They slowed their pace, reduced radio chatter, widened their spacing, and tried to make their movement less structured. On paper, they were doing exactly what they had observed. The difference showed almost immediately. The patrol moved slower than usual, but it wasn't natural. The pauses were slightly too long, the movement between them slightly too deliberate. Boots still scraped on dry ground because the load hadn't changed. Equipment still shifted. Radios were quieter, but not silent. More importantly, the Marines still carried visible intent. They moved like men expecting contact, just at a reduced speed. The SAS operators noticed it within minutes. They didn't interrupt. They let the patrol continue. At around 10:25, the first sign appeared. Not contact, but absence. A stretch of ground that should have shown normal activity was empty. No movement near the compounds, no distant signs of routine life. In that environment, silence like that meant the area had already reacted to something. One of the SAS operators raised a hand and stopped the patrol. No urgency, no sharp command. Just a stop. The Marines froze, some dropping slightly lower, instinctively preparing for contact. That reaction alone changed how the patrol looked. It no longer resembled movement through the area. It looked like a unit waiting for something to happen. The SAS operator moved forward alone, checking the ground near an irrigation line. There were footprints, not fresh, but not old. The pattern mattered more than the age. Movement had shifted away from expected routes. He stood, scanned slowly, then returned and signaled a change of direction. No explanation, just movement. They adjusted left, moving parallel to a line of low compounds. The Marines followed, trying to match pace and spacing. But again, it wasn't just movement. It was how it appeared. The SAS moved like nothing had changed. The Marines moved like they were reacting to something unseen. At 10:38, the contact came. A short burst of automatic fire from a tree line roughly 150 meters ahead, followed by two more bursts from offset positions. Not a full ambush, a probe. The kind of engagement used to confirm a target before committing further. The Marines reacted immediately and correctly, returning fire and moving to cover. The patrol broke contact cleanly and pulled back without casualties. Tactically, it was handled well, but the outcome was already decided before the first shot. They had been recognized. Back at the patrol base, there was no confusion, only frustration. The Marines had done what they thought was required, slowed down, reduced noise, adjusted formation. And it had not worked. The conversation that followed was quiet. A Marine squad leader asked the question directly. What had gone wrong? The SAS operator took a moment before answering. Then he said, "You tried to move like us. You didn't try to think like us." That was the difference. Slowing down was not the method. It was the result of reading the environment correctly. The SAS were not following a rule about pace. They were matching the ground, the time of day, the likely observation points. Every movement came from interpretation, not imitation. The Marines had changed their speed, but not their understanding. They were still imposing behavior onto the terrain instead of letting the terrain shape it. The gap showed in small details, foot placement that avoided loose debris without hesitation, routes that were not the most direct but avoided natural observation lines, pauses that happened at moments where movement would normally stop, not where it felt tactically safe. The SAS were not trying to be invisible, they were trying to be unremarkable. Equipment played a role as well. The SAS carried less because they needed less. Every item had a purpose tied directly to the mission. The Marines were still carrying standard loadouts, necessary in most environments, but here they created weight, and weight created sound. Even when minimized, it was enough to build a pattern. But the most important difference was intent. The SAS did not move like men trying to avoid contact. They moved like men who had already decided contact would not happen unless they allowed it. That mindset removed visible tension. The Marines still carried it. It showed in how they scanned, how they paused, how they reacted to uncertainty. Those signals were enough for an experienced observer to identify them as a threat. Over the next few days, the joint patrols continued. The Marines stopped trying to copy what they saw directly. Instead, they started asking questions. Why that route? Why that pause? Why move through open ground at one moment and avoid it at another? The answers were short and specific. Because that ground funnels observation. Because that wall creates shadow at this time. Because movement is expected there, not here. It was not about being unseen, it was about controlling how you were seen. On a later patrol, the difference became clear. Same terrain, same daylight conditions, same kind of objective. This time the Marines moved differently. Not slower, but with less visible tension. Less focus on controlling every movement, more focus on understanding what mattered. The SAS operators said almost nothing during the patrol. There was no contact, not because the enemy was gone, but because the patrol no longer presented a clear reason to engage. That was when it started to settle in. This was not a technique. It was a way of thinking built over years in environments where being detected meant failure long before any firefight began. The valley had not changed. The enemy had not changed. But the patrol had. And that was enough. Once that shift began, it didn't stop. By the second week, the change was no longer theoretical. It was visible in one simple outcome. Patrols were returning from areas that previously produced contact almost every time. The terrain had not changed. The enemy had not changed. What changed was how patrols moved through the ground, and more importantly, how they were interpreted while doing it. The shift became clear on a patrol that stepped off just after 9:30 into a sector known for repeated enemy movement along irrigation lines and compound clusters. Earlier attempts to operate there had failed consistently. Patrols were either detected early or forced to withdraw before gathering usable intelligence. The assumption had been constant observation. The reality was more selective. The area was not watched all the time, only when something appeared abnormal. This time, the patrol composition was the same, a Marine element with SAS integration. But the movement from the start was different. There was no forced, slow movement, no exaggerated caution. When the ground allowed normal movement, they moved normally. When it didn't, they adjusted without drawing attention to the adjustment. That alone removed a pattern that had defined earlier patrols. The first hour passed without incident. That mattered more than expected. Previous patrols rarely went that far without detection. When they approached the central observation zone, they avoided the obvious high ground. Earlier patrols had consistently treated elevation as the priority, moving directly toward it and exposing themselves in predictable ways. This time, they bypassed those positions and settled into lower ground with fewer expected observation angles. It wasn't the best place to observe from. It was the least likely place to be noticed. They established position just before 11 o'clock. No digging, no unnecessary movement, no visible preparation beyond what was required. The ground was hard, uneven, and exposed to heat. Stillness was physically uncomfortable, but it was accepted without adjustment. Stillness was not a tactic here. It was a condition. For the next 2 hours, nothing happened. That was the real test, not movement, not contact, but absence. Earlier patrols filled this time with small adjustments, shifting gear, scanning more aggressively, repositioning slightly. Individually insignificant, but together they formed a pattern. This time those movements were reduced to absolute necessity. Observation replaced anticipation. At 13:12, the first movement appeared. 2 fighters along an irrigation line. Not rushing, not scanning heavily. They moved the way people move when they believe they are not being watched. They passed through observation range and continued without hesitation. The patrol did not react. No repositioning, no communication beyond confirmation. The information was recorded, not acted on. 20 minutes later, a second group appeared. 4 men carrying equipment consistent with resupply. Same route, same pace, same assumption of safety. This was the point where earlier patrols would have engaged. Targets in the open, within range, clear opportunity. The instinct was there, but the SAS operator closest to the Marine team leader gave a small signal. No engagement. The reasoning had already been explained in theory, but now it mattered in practice. Engaging would confirm presence. It would collapse the route immediately. It would turn a living system into a reaction. Letting them pass preserved the pattern long enough to understand it. The Marines held fire. That decision changed the patrol. Over the next hour, more movement followed. Small groups, spaced intervals, consistent timing. Enough to confirm structure rather than randomness. The patrol began building a real-time picture. Number of fighters using the route, direction of movement, likely origin points, and timing cycles. Intelligence that could not be gathered through contact, because contact would have ended the behavior immediately. By late afternoon, the structure was clear. The route functioned as a controlled supply corridor between compounds. Movement increased at predictable intervals and dropped at others. There was rhythm to it. Not chaos, not constant surveillance, but a system. When the patrol extracted just after 1600, the movement was identical to insertion. No urgency, no visible change. They left the area exactly as they had entered it. Unremarkable. Back at base, the difference was immediate. There was no post-contact adrenaline cycle, no fatigue from engagement. Just a quiet confirmation that the mission had worked differently from anything before. The Marines who had been present didn't describe it in tactical terms at first. They described it as clarity. They had seen something, understood it, and left it intact. The formal debrief focused on data, timings, counts, routes, patterns. But the informal conversations carried more weight. The Marines who had tried to replicate SAS movement earlier now described the difference more precisely. It's not about being quiet, it's about not triggering interpretation. That was the key. The SAS operators did not present this as a new technique. For them, it was normal operating logic. In environments like this, survival was not about avoiding detection entirely. It was about avoiding classification as a threat. Visibility was not the problem. Interpretation was. The Marines were beginning to understand that distinction, slowly but clearly. Over the following days, patrol behavior shifted again. Not in speed alone, not in formation alone, but in intent. Less focus on controlling every movement. More focus on reading how movement would be perceived. Results followed. Fewer early detections, more usable intelligence, fewer reactive engagements. Not elimination of contact, but control over when contact occurred. That was the real shift. Not silence, not stealth, but timing. It didn't remove aggression, it refined it. Engagement was still there, still necessary, still unavoidable in many cases. But it was no longer automatic, it became conditional. And that changed everything about how patrols were planned and understood. By the end of the second week, the SAS were no longer seen as a separate method. They were understood as a different way of interpreting the same environment. Not better in every situation, but fundamentally different in how they processed risk, movement, and attention. The valley stayed the same. The compounds, the irrigation lines, the observation points all remained unchanged. The enemy was still present, still capable of reacting at any moment. But now, more often than not, nothing reacted. And that silence was no longer accidental. By the time the operation reached its later stages, something had already shifted that no report fully captured. It wasn't a change in enemy capability or terrain conditions. It was a change in understanding. Patrols that once moved into contact-heavy areas were now returning with intelligence instead of firefights. Commanders noticed the trend, but those on the ground understood it more clearly. Something fundamental about how presence was perceived had changed. The SAS did not treat it as a revelation. For them, it was simply how you survived in environments where visibility was as dangerous as movement. But for the Marines working alongside them, it was something else entirely. It challenged assumptions that had been built over years of training. That speed meant safety, that aggression controlled the battlefield, that contact was an unavoidable part of presence. In Helmand, those assumptions were breaking down. The most important patrol came near the end of the rotation. It wasn't marked in any official way. There was no special objective, no named target. Just another movement through a sector that had already been partially mapped through earlier reconnaissance. The difference was that this time there was no expectation of contact at all. Not because the threat was gone, but because the pattern of how contact happened was now understood. They moved at 10:15 under clear daylight. The same mixed composition, but the behavior had changed across the entire patrol, not just the SAS element. There was no forced discipline, no artificial slowing, no exaggerated caution. Movement matched terrain naturally. When the ground allowed normal walking, they walked. When it required adjustment, they adjusted without signaling it. The difference was no longer external, it had been absorbed. For the first hour, nothing happened. That was no longer unusual. Silence in the valley had shifted meaning. It was no longer a warning sign, it was data. It indicated absence of triggering conditions, not absence of observation. The patrol moved through irrigation lines, compounds, and open stretches without altering its behavior in response to imagined pressure. That alone was a change from earlier operations. At 11:40, a small observation point was reached overlooking a known movement corridor. In previous cycles, this would have been a moment of tension. Instead, it was routine. The patrol settled in, not because it was safe, but because it was the correct position to observe without interference. No unnecessary movement followed, no scanning beyond what was required. The environment was allowed to exist without reaction. Minutes passed, then movement appeared below. Two fighters moving along a predictable route, then another group, then a third, spaced in a pattern that now made sense because it had been observed repeatedly. This was no longer unknown territory, it was a system. The critical difference this time was what did not happen. No engagement, no adjustment of posture, no emotional response to opportunity. The patrol simply observed. The fighters passed through without changing their behavior. That continuity was important. It confirmed that the system only changed when interrupted. Later, during extraction, the conversation between Marines reflected something that had not been present at the beginning of the rotation. There was no confusion anymore, no attempt to reconcile what they were seeing with older doctrine. Instead, there was acceptance of a simpler idea. That presence itself was not the problem. Interpretation of presence was. One of the Marines summarized it in a way that stayed with the unit long after. It's not that they don't see you. It's that they don't classify you in time. That was the shift, not invisibility, not stealth in the traditional sense, but delay in recognition. A gap between observation and reaction that allowed movement without consequence. The SAS did not frame it that way. They didn't need to. For them, it was the result of years operating in environments where being detected was irrelevant compared to being understood correctly. They had learned, long before Afghanistan, that most engagements were decided before the first shot, not in firepower, but in interpretation. As the rotation ended, the broader impact began to appear in training discussions and informal exchanges between units. Marines who had worked alongside the SAS carried the experience back into their own environments, not as doctrine, but as instinct. Smaller changes first, reduced noise in movement, less emphasis on constant reaction, more attention to how movement would be perceived rather than how it would be executed. At the same time, SAS operators who had worked with US units acknowledged something in return. The scale of coordination, the integration of air support, the speed of logistical response. These were capabilities they did not possess in the same way. The lesson was not one-sided. It never is in environments like that. It was a convergence, two systems that had evolved differently under different pressures, finding points of overlap under shared conditions. But the most lasting change was not operational. It was psychological. For many of the Marines involved, the experience altered how they understood risk, not as something to be eliminated, but as something to be shaped. Not every threat required a reaction. Not every observation required confirmation. Sometimes the most effective action was allowing the environment to continue without forcing it to respond. By the time they left Helmand, there was no single moment that defined the shift, no dramatic engagement that marked the change. Just a gradual realization built over patrols, silence, and decisions not to act. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself but becomes obvious in hindsight. The valley remained unchanged after they left. The compounds, the irrigation lines, the routes between them all continued as they had before. The enemy remained present in the same way they always had been, observing, reacting, adapting. But something had changed in how they were met. Not by force, not by speed, not by dominance. but by understanding when not to be what the enemy expected. And that, more than anything else, was what the mountain had taught them.